Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesday, everybody. I am so thrilled to welcome my friend Franklin Okanu, who's also known as the alchemic pharmacist, to the podcast. Franklin is the founder of the Unorthodoxy, which is a Substack that explores the spiritual dimensions of modern life through a holistic lens. With a doctorate in pharmacy and a background that bridges Pentecostal Christianity, Eastern philosophies, quantum physics, and psychology, Franklin brings such a unique perspective to the table. From challenging conventional views to crafting a plan that is rooted in spiritual and natural principles, his journey is one of resilience, curiosity, and deep integration. And join us as we explore how he blends science, spirituality, and practical wisdom to foster a deeper understanding of the world around us. Franklin, thank you so much for taking the time to join all of us today. I am ready to just dive right in because if you guys aren't on his Substack, you're going to have tons of links in the show notes to get to it. Okay, you got to tell me a little bit. I mean, we just chatted for a while beforehand on your journey of how you bridge science because you have a background in pharmacology, like a PhD background, not just like, a 4-year. But now you talk about spirituality, you talk about personal growth in such a unique way. That's why we could talk for hours. So could you share with me and the listeners, what was there a pivotal moment? Because you said your growth happened like pre-pandemic and mine was a lot of pandemic. So was it a realization? Like what inspired you to look at this interconnectedness in the ways that eventually led you to launch Unorthodoxy and write your book maybe?
Absolutely. Again, hey, Megan, thanks for having me here. Glad to be here. Lovely. We'll talk for hours, but I will try to be super succinct with my responses. So as we talked about, I grew up Pentecostal Christian. I'm Nigerian by background, right? And so Nigerian just has a lot of rich spirituality. If you've ever been just anywhere outside the United States, you realize a lot of these places have a lot of rich spirituality. And so growing up, I knew that, spirituality is very real. As I talked about, I've had experiences with just miracles I could tell you as a kid, right? Like, okay, so there's something here. So I grew up in that. Again, as you mentioned, my background, right? And so what that science background really drilled down was just the appreciation for science, hypothesis, reality, because this is how the world operates. And I guess just growing up, I don't know if this is just like normal, but always wanted to be the best, right? Hey, how do I be better than myself? It might be due to the whole Aries astrology. I don't know, right? But there was always this drive to, hey, I want to better myself. And so that's how all that happened. And so I talk about this, but I was a straight-laced, good kid. If you read my article on the marijuana, great kid, right? I was literally a model kid until I graduated. And when I graduated, I'm in the world now. And I'm experiencing all kinds of stuff, right? I'm making money so I can go to different experiences and I can meet different people and all that stuff. And so you start having conversations and philosophical ideas and whatnot. And I saw the movie The Zygus, which really brought the historical facts of Christianity. It's like, whoa, wait a second. You had other civilizations that were around before Christianity. So why do we only focus on this? And so that really happened around 2014, 2015. I remember back in the day, I had this comment with this guy and it was just online and I was a diehard Christian and he made a comment about, just the historical accuracy of Christianity. And I got so heated. We got so mad at each other. It was crazy. Like 5 years later, I was like, oh my gosh, he was so right. He was trying to open my eyes and I just didn't realize it, right? But a story for another day because that's just a long time. But throughout like 2014, 2015, 2016, I began to realize, whoa, if I've been lied to about Christianity, like, what else could I have been lied to about? And as I was working in the field at the time, I had this leader who told me, listen, do you do what you do because I told you to? Or do you do what you do because you understand why you're doing it? And to this day, as you can see, that really struck with me as to why am I doing this, right? And so from like 15, 16, 17, I'm going on this literal metamorphosis myself. I actually quit. I actually stopped working. I stopped working. I left pharmacy behind, and that's another story as to what happened to make me leave that, right? But I stopped working, and I literally just locked myself in my room and just devoured all sorts of information for like 2 years, right? Just 2 years. So that was my time in really understanding the world and really gaining. Got it. Okay, so this is how the world operates. This is where I come in, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm aware. I know what's going on a little bit, but I'm still learning. Fast forward to that pandemic, right? And it's like, oh, wow, we're actually really about to shut down, right? So now I go back into work, but in a different space now,
Mm.
right? And so I'm like, oh, we're really about to shut down. This is crazy. And around this time, I read the book. It's called Personal MBA by, I think it's like Andrew Kaufman or something like that. It was another one of those personal development books, et cetera, et cetera. And he was talking about how he wanted to go to business school, but he didn't want to. So what did he do? He just read a lot of business stuff and he put all of his ideas online just to help him understand it, right? And I'm like, you know what? That's actually pretty cool. Let me do that. Let me just start as I'm learning, just take my ideas and put it online. I was actually writing on Medium at the time, but Medium, come to find out, was actually being funded by Bill Gates. So if you say anything about Bill Gates, of course they're not going to let you on. They kicked me off, right? And I somehow just randomly found Substack and I didn't take it seriously. Last thing was to what really prompted me into unorthodoxy was two things. Number one, I don't know if you guys are familiar with James Corbett, but I watch a James Corbett series on media, and that completely changed my life to just how the power of media has shifted human history, starting with the printing press. Like, it sounds so simple, but when you really understand just the power of media and narratives, life blowing, right? And so I'm
Yeah.
like, yo, I've got to do something here, right? And then last thing, I saw this on social media. I saw this crazy this reel, and it was this influencer, and he was saying, "Listen, all it takes is 3 years to change your life around. In year one, you're gonna get used to what exactly you're doing. In year two, it becomes a habit. Year three, you're really gonna see the change, right?" And also around this time, like the Federal Reserve was like, "Hey, listen, we're about to raise interest rates again." Right? So all of this is happening at the same time. I'm like, you know what? I gotta do something. Like, I just can't sit by and just let the Federal Reserve do this and all this stuff. I've got to do something here.
Right.
And so if you look in like 2022, I actually start writing a lot more on my Substack. I really start taking it seriously, and that's where we are now. So I'm 2 years into that whole 3 year journey, and that's a whole series of just random circumstances, which now we can call synchronicities, is
Right.
literally how I've developed this Substack. So when I experience something, I distill it down. Listen, someone might find value in it. Let me put it online, and bam, that's how we have unorthodoxy.
That is so cool because, as you know, I can from our conversation a little bit how much I can relate to that. The listeners probably know, like, whoa, that sounds a lot like our host here, Megan Lee, for sure, because that's what
Yeah.
I've done. And even though my audience is small, you never know because that doesn't mean not everyone knows that not everyone lets you know they're listening
Yeah.
or
Oh,
reading.
100%.
And
A
so
hundred.
that's what I have to remind myself. And
Yeah.
like, I just have fun writing so much. Like I'm doing a workbook called Healing Through Words, and it's like
Yeah.
prompted writing. And
Yeah.
so I share some of them, which is very vulnerable from my journal on Substack just for funsies. And like, that's cool too. So I do really appreciate that. I'm excited because I saw how well your like screen was organized when I look at it from a desktop, and I was like, oh snap, this looks so good. Like, so I can tell that, like, yeah, it looks really great, really well organized. So I
Yep.
see when you mentioned the esoteric stuff, I know exactly where that was. I saw that on your website. So thank you for that. And something you touched on that I really appreciate that we'll talk about at the very end of the interview, guys, is he wrote an article called The Power of Belief. And you discussed kind of in your process to getting to unorthodoxy, it's basically if we blindly accept the narratives we're told or not. And that's what you realized in your awakening was like, wait a minute, why am I doing this? Am I doing this just because I was told to? Or it's because it's like this internal drive, or it's because I actually comprehend and understand why I'm doing it? Because that is a whole nother level of
Yep.
application. So I really appreciated that. And we'll talk more about the power of belief at the end of the interview, because that is one of the main reasons why I had to pick your brain, because that's so much about what we talk about here. The tagline is like, stay curious, embrace skepticism.
Yep.
And that's what we're all about. And so in your article that you wrote, what happened to critical thinking after COVID? This was just so, I don't know, cathartic for me, gratifying for me to read, because my experience through COVID was very painful. I've mentioned I've lost a lot of friends, like my absolute best friend, my only best, like I have two, but my closest friend was just like over the vaccine thing.
Yeah.
Just was like broke up with me. And I'm so gutted by it still to this day. And I've talked about media narratives in regards to plant-based narratives on another podcast with my friend about narrative consensus and how
Mm-hmm.
that can override in science. So we have mentioned that concept with my friend Jay last season. So you talk about how media narratives can discourage critical thinking,
Yep.
and you also described critical thinking as a spiritual gift.
Yep.
And so I thought that was super cool, and that helped me feel a little less lonely, or like, I don't know, because that's what I mean by cathartic. I was like, okay, I'm not the only one out here, even if I don't see you face to face. And so can you share a little bit more? Because you mentioned the climate change debate. And
Yep.
my buddy Jay talks about that all the time. I've not really touched on it too much here on the podcast, but I really want to.
Yep.
So you touched on that in the article. So can you share a little bit more about your personal experience there, how that shaped like your understanding of narrative warfare? Because you've already mentioned that in your big breakdown on how we got to unorthodoxy. And also, yeah, let's go there. Like, what happened? How did you figure out narrative
Yeah.
warfare is a thing? Because you mentioned that guy's work. I looked it up, James Corbett, which I'll link in the show notes. And yeah, the printing press, because about theology, and that was like when the King James Bible and the
Yep.
Schofield Bible and premillennialism and dispensationalism and the power of Israel. That's when all that stuff started coming out. And I think that
Exactly.
is narrative control 100%. So
Yep.
let's talk more about that.
Absolutely, and that's why I never loved history. I don't know about you, but history was just it was just there. And I actually wrote an article about that. Like history is just there, right? But when you realize that, oh wait, this is how we got to be here. Whoa, this is completely different, right? And so you have to look at how narratives come, because narratives. I have an article. Narratives build reality. It's simple. Narratives build reality. That's how simple it is, right? And when you really look at history, I like to simplify things as much as possible. And when you look at history, especially human history, there's really two parts. There are the rulers of human history, and that's like the monarchy, the government, etc. You have everybody else. That's it. It's really the little versus the many. That's as simplified as it is, right? And so, well, all throughout history, the little has always been overthrown time and time. It's just like they're always going to get overthrown because people are just going to say enough. And then eventually the little says, you know what? How do we stop this cycle? Well, guess what? If we control the narratives and we can give the illusions of reality and what reality is, we can essentially have the masses have this idea that they are good, they are free, and no one will revolt. And that's what my book is really about. That's literally the last 200 years of all these narratives. And so now everyone thinks we're good, but they want to, and they can, they'll give you a totalitarian idea, which is where COVID comes in and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so what happened on social media was, when you're on social media, you will interact with people that you don't know, right? But you guys might resonate on this idea or that idea. And so, with this election with Trump and Kamala, this individual, especially online, unless you're in a very like Republican space, social media is very left, right? Because of just the censorship and everything. So this is an individual who resonated with me on just the politics and how everything was, just a facade and all that stuff. And so what happened was they posted a comment on how humans were just this horrible species because we were polluting the earth. And I was like, whoa, why would you say that? Like, it's not us who are doing the pollution. First of all, it's corporations that are doing the pollution, but you have to realize, this whole climate change narrative, it's really not that. Like, polar bears aren't dying. Like, we actually have a lot of polar bears that are actually growing and thriving. Before I could even like follow up and say XYZ, I gave them one of my articles, which is, hey, listen, I actually wrote this article. And this person said, you know what, I'm not even gonna read your article. I'm just gonna stop this right here. And I was like, yeah, what the fudge? What, like, we've interacted before, right? Like, why would you know me, right? You don't know me personally, but we've had an online relationship. Why would you just shut off my conversation without even checking out my work? And so I thought about that. And then ironically, just that same weekend, I came across this article that was an old article from the pandemic, right? And I'm like, that's right. During the pandemic, we had phrases like trust the science, right? Don't do like You literally had the narrative telling people don't do your own research. Can you believe that? That sounds so stupid nowadays, right? How, as a grown man, don't do my own research? Am I 12? Am I just going to believe what you tell me? Like, what the fudge, right? Going back to what you said about the vaccine, like, I was literally shocked. Guys, in no circumstances would we just take something like this, right? But all of a sudden, like, it was literally mind blowing. I'm like, okay, this is what a time to be alive here, right? And so
Yeah.
I really like that scenario on climate change really made me realize, okay, listen, if you're not careful, these narratives are going to give you, as I said earlier, a form of reality that you're going to go down to. And we talked about this earlier, but just that inner voice that something's off here. And I think that's a critical gift that we all have, but just due to the indoctrination and the repetition of these narratives over and over, people actually learn to shut off that voice, which is unfortunately the sad part. But I think you and I are helping people kind of regain their voice back.
That is so true, because we talk a lot about that in Christianity, not as much on the Pentecostal side of Christianity, I think, because in regards to denying the intuitive voice, because Pentecostal Christianity, they're, from what I understand and from when I was in the church of those beliefs, they believe that God can speak to them. I'm like struggling with my voice today. And so that would allow for a little bit more of like this connection to divinity, a little bit more mysticism, kind of like Greek, or like the Orthodoxy church, a little more of the like interesting side. Like, I think it's much more interesting form of spirituality. And then I found myself wanting to be more conservative, thinking that was wrong. Though Pentecostal, they just started in the 1900s. They just made all this up, so I started getting more and more conservative. And then I think that was what became more and more harmful, was this more denying that intuition, because that's when women can't be pastors. That's when, like, I was yelling at my husband. I was like, you have to stop reading about maple trees because I can't know all this about theology. You have to know more about theology. We're out of order. We're making God mad. Like, you have to be the spiritual leader of the house. That's what was happening.
Yeah.
Bad news bears nowhere. And so I was like really denying this internal battle. And that's part of that awakening. There's all of a sudden realizing, wait a minute. Wait a minute. And so I'm really excited that you touched on that. And I do hope that people who are, conscious enough to, it's almost like you have to be ready to hear what we're saying. You have to be ready to even hear it. And so if you're listening to it, that probably means that you are ready to hear it. And so we're happy to have you here. So are there any like practical strategies that you would like, can we distill down that you, in regards to reclaiming critical thought and in the media saturated world? So many folks said that I met in the deconstruction world, they broke up with Christianity because of Trump.
Yep.
And they just hate him so much. And they have Trump derangement syndrome, which I hear you. I mean, he's not a perfect human, but I'm also not delusioned either. And so it's just really sad to see how they say they deconstructed, but they really just found themselves in another echo chamber and another form of ideological shackles. Mm-hmm. And so I've been trying to speak to that. So can you help us out here with some practical tips?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think one of the biggest things that I can comment here is, and I think, so I wrote two articles. One is how to see the world, and one is how to train your mind, right? Because we all have these voices in our heads. We all have these pulls and whatnot. And so, again, I really rely on philosophy, because philosophy is really just understanding just the reality of the world. And there's this principle in philosophy. So philosophy and principles are one of my biggest themes. The principle is I think it's called Occam's razor, to where it's like, yo, listen, you have to be as simple as possible. So, well, let's look at this life, right? Let's make life as simple as possible, right? And so the way I distill it is, guess what? You are a soul. That's it. Who you are at the end of the day, you are a divine soul. That's our starting point. Like, if every kid just grew up knowing that I am a divine soul, and that's number one, perfect. Well, number two is you have a body, and your body is here to experience this reality, this physical reality, right? That's really the two things everyone needs to understand. Now, in the other article, how to train your mind. Well, you're a soul, you have a body, you've got this amazing piece of just information, just call your mind. And guess what? That mind will talk to you in so many different ways. I have a struggle with ice cream. Well, guess what? Is that my mind telling me is that my soul saying I need ice cream? Or is that my body via my mind telling me I want some ice cream? So your soul has to go through the exercise of deciphering all these different voices. And we're just talking about ice cream. Now let's take that and bring that to online where you don't know people. Just think about how many thoughts you happen because you see something. That's how our mind operates, right? Because, and my argument about the mind is it's not in our brain. It's really just how we take information from all our senses. Because if I hear something, that triggers a thought. If I see something, that triggers a thought. If I smell something, that, so these are all the thoughts that I have to deal with, right? While I have to respond to this online comment. And so one of the biggest things I've realized, going back to James Corbett and his course, online, as great as online is, and you can have some beautiful relationships from online, like what you and I have now. This is the spectrum, the good spectrum of online. The bad spectrum is the online space is a place for your, quote, inner troll to come out. Think about that. Like, we call people trolls online. Again, going back to the spiritual aspect of reality, the word troll is your inner demon, right? So you've got this inner demon that just wants to come out, and online gives it the space. So with that background into online and just how everything reality is, like, how can we critically engage in this, right? So number one, that whenever you see anything online, you gotta take a step back. You gotta process that, because your mind is giving you information. You're forming all these narratives before your soul has a chance to even process what's going on. Your mind is going to give you 20 ideas as to F this, F that, blah, 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 blah. Well, let's take a step back and let's realize what just happened, right? Okay, I'm very angry right now. My body's angry, my blood pressure's up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, let me take a step back and let me calm down. And I will say, it is extremely hard to do online. It's extremely hard to do online. But by taking the step back and realizing and seeing the bigger picture here, you're able to respond more humanly, more divinely. It's okay, hey, what are we talking about here, right? So that's the biggest source that I practice. Okay, listen, let me take a step back before I just get into Twitter fingers here, right? And so, exactly.
Yeah. I did a little, very fast typing. If you can hear my dog,
yeah,
she's being ridiculous in the background. Okay, so there's so many things I want to touch on that you just said. I really appreciate, just the most practical tip is like, just must step back and slow down. I definitely, I do that quite a bit. I pushed, especially because I do like to show up on Instagram. I stopped now because Instagram is just like faded out. Whatever was good, we're over that spectrum.
Yeah.
But I still would show up there and kind of push back, and then not really have I do like having constructive conversations.
Yeah.
But that doesn't often happen. And so something I want to talk about, there is a concept that I learned from Dr. Gregory Karras, who we mentioned before we pushed record. He talked about this concept of narcissistic rage when you're in fundamentalist ideologies. And that really helped me understand. And then in another conversation with my pal Jay, I've already mentioned, it was called emotional hijacks, because we were talking about the amygdala hijacking. And then we talk about that in Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Daniel Goleman. And it's also referenced a lot in Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, which expands more on Daniel's work. So fascinating, because like when that amygdala gets triggered, which is exactly what you were saying, we have to start noticing what are the physical sensations of that. For most of us, it's going to be elevated heart rate, sweaty palms, and that's knowing that that's your physical body telling you that now your prefrontal cortex, which is the responsible, logical, more probably, like, there's other parts of your brain too, but like all the how you probably want to respond is not activated right now. And so the best way to get that back online is by creating space. That's literally the nitty gritty of therapy, is take a step back, because your biology is overriding your soul's intention right now. 100%. And that's really what it comes down to doing. So I really appreciated that. It's so much easier said than done. So like 100%. We're all on board with that. And so when you mentioned earlier about like trying to advocate for Christianity, that's all season 1 was being like, where's the biblical truth? And then realizing the person that was pushing back on you had some facts on that about like how Christianity, nothing really is new or original to Christianity. And I'm about to read a book that was recommended to me on another podcast called Christianity Before Christ by John J. Jackson. Guys, I got it used online. And so this is basically where Christianity is present and all these other mythologies that flourished before Jesus is alleged to live. And so, this is just like stuff that we like to read when we're not stuck in the group identity. So if you're willing to look outside of the group identity, willing to break the credence that somebody is wanting you to say, like, That's basically what happened to me when I became a Christian. I was like, what do I have to say I believe? Like all these credences that were basically, they've gotten longer and longer since that first
Mm-hmm.
meeting of the bishops in 325 with Constantinople or whatever. And so I really appreciate so much of what you said. So thank you for those tips. And guys, I think just being aware of our sweaty palms, elevated heart rate, and try to set some sort of rule with yourself. Like, am I going to respond to this comment at all? Is it
Yep.
worth responding to? And then, maybe just distract yourself where it doesn't have I try to sleep on it, honestly, but that can be a long duration. And sometimes I might have more anxiety if I don't handle the situation
Of
and like
course. Of
deny
course.
it. So guys, I just want to touch on, we understand there's nuance here and I don't really want to tell you what you should do. And so this was something that I applied this principle. We're moving on to the next question about you critique the rise of echo chambers and the blocking culture online in the article about what happened to critical thinking. And so I really appreciate that because I struggle a lot with that. And I think there are some boundaries. Like I told you, I got kicked out of sometimes people are just it's not fruitful. And
Mm-hmm.
so finding that balance. So I didn't block someone today, the woman, Cindy, who came at me with her
Yep.
cold-hearted Christian spiritual bypassing nonsense. Can you tell me a little bit more in your view about how you can help all of us foster a culture where we have intellectual resilience? I'm
Yep.
not fragile. I'm not unsafe. So
Yeah.
how do we have more openness with engaging with the challenging or opposing viewpoints? Take it away.
100%. Thank you so much. Right. And I think one thing that's happened with COVID, and it started before COVID, was just the softening of humanity. Like we've become so soft. You can't say anything anymore. Right. And what that's done is it's really pushed away true intellectual rigor, right? Where people would sit here and have ideas and share ideas. And I actually read an article the other day, and I'm going to write an article about it, but it was about disagreements. And I think we mentioned this before. But at its core, what disagreements are is two individuals who just don't see eye to eye. That is such a crazy concept. Wow, you mean there's two different humans who have a different experience on life and they just don't see eye to eye? That's so crazy, right? But the problem is, though, when we disagree, instead of trying to resolve that gap in experiences, it becomes personal. It becomes very personal. And so now, again, going back, instead of me taking it back and say, okay, you were addressing this situation that occurred. No, now I feel that you're addressing me. So I feel attacked. So guess what? I'm going to attack you back. Now, as you can see, this requires a lot of intellectually processing, right? Okay, let's calm down first before we react. Let's see where they're coming from, right? Again, it's so hard to do online, but guess what? When you lock people in their homes for 2, 3, 4 years, this is what you're creating. Like this is exactly what you want to occur. So no one has relationships, no one thinks anymore, right? And so everything is just immediate, right? What you're doing is you are creating a fertile ground for that animalistic aspect of humanity to reign
Yeah.
supreme. And so one of the tools is blocking. You know what? You pissed me off, block, right? You say something, block. That's literally what happened to me, like with the whole climate change. Like, I don't get a chance to rebuttal. Like, you just gonna block me? Like, what the fudge, right? And the sad part about it is that it is somewhat celebrated, right? Oh yeah, I block, and it's so crazy. People just block, even in relationships now, right? Someone said you're dating someone and they send the wrong text, you block. I was just like, what the fudge is this, right? Now, what happens is it goes back to just creating this soft, cozy environment, this echo chamber to where I feel safe, I have my safe space, and I can't be bothered. And this whole safe space actually started on colleges, right? And it's sad because college is where you go. College for me changed, as you can tell, it changed my life, right?
Right.
I argued, right? People were able to push me to where I see your perspective now. But now, no, we don't want that. We want you to stay safe, right? And so what the idea is, ultimately we have to realize, if someone has a different perspective than you, really, well, what happened to you to make you say that? Because this is what happened to me. And one of the ideas that the article says is, number one, okay, let's level set right now. What exactly is a conversation, right? Let's, just so that I don't get personally irate, what exactly are we talking about, right? So let's remove all personal biases or any personal attacks here, and let's focus only on this. The other piece is, you know what? I'm going to help you strengthen your argument. And what does that do? It makes sure that I understand where you're coming from, right? And I want to make sure I really understand where you're coming from, right? And the third piece is, once I really understand where you're coming from, now I can critique what is wrong with your points, because you may not have experienced X or Y or Z. So now, and as I'm going through this, as I'm strengthening your point and then critiquing your point, I'm also getting an experience into your perspective. And if you're doing the exact same to me, now our perspectives begin to merge, right? And so now we can still disagree, but at least we have a better understanding from the opposing view, and we're a lot stronger by that. And that's what's not occurring, because disagreements are one of the most fundamental aspects of humanity coming together. But guess what? I don't want you coming together. I want you guys divided. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to where your inner troll will always come out first. Hence, we have on our online communities.
Yeah, and they're really not much of a community at all.
Exactly.
And I really appreciate that. So just so you guys know, anything that we've mentioned, like Franklin has named so many articles he has written, I will link them all in the show notes if you guys want to explore more in there to make that easy for you. Or what I mentioned about the amygdala overdrive or any of that stuff. So if you're curious about any of these nuggets we're dropping and you want to go on more rabbit holes, I will allow it. So I will make it easier for you. So I really appreciate so much of what you just touched on. I picked up a book because I just can't find it yet. The Righteous Mind, because he really talks, the author really talks a lot of truth. You have to understand the other side. And that takes a lot. Like, you can't be in your amygdala hijacking in order to like sit there and like have these conversations, to not take things personal, to be willing to be curious yourself in order, and I also read from Peggy Hall, The Healthy American. I love her so much.
Peggy. I love
Yeah,
Peggy.
me too. And so she was giving out good advice for Thanksgiving. And one of the things she was saying too was like, just ask questions, because most people don't think too hard about, especially if they're in these like narcissistic rage or these ideological echo chambers. They're just like we were in Christianity's reciting the creeds. So there are holes in those arguments. And if we don't, and we can easily help them find those own holes and most people don't respond well when you're saying, you're wrong, and let me tell you why. And I really am working on that. I am. And so by just asking more questions, they feel heard, they feel understood, which will keep their amygdala not getting activated. And you will learn and grow yourself, as you were saying. So it is a win-win. It is not easy to do, but it is, I think, any of us who have been on both sides of the spectrum, which is me or which you perhaps, we can understand progressives. We can understand where they're coming from. I can understand where conservatives are coming from. And so the one thing that this book talks about that I do want to touch on is it talks about morals, and where this is all about moral psychology. So this would be so up your alley to read The Righteous Mind. I think you would really like it. And so he tried to make justify 5 guesses on where and how we respond. So you mentioned earlier, we see something and we like literally are triggered. So you are so right about that. So much about the morals in our human nature are actually driven by emotions, and that's actually really good. And in the emotional intelligence books, it talks about how logic and emotion are not separate things. You actually need your emotion to be logical, but it's about not let it override you. So there's the care/harm foundation. And so that's where we want to care for vulnerable children, or care for the vulnerable, the hurt, the ostracized. So the left and they really align strongly with that. That's basically their main point. Is like, we have to take care of the oppressed. But what the conservatives, which is fascinating because he makes this argument, even though this author leans to the left, conservatives, there's 5 elements he guesses that are about morals. And they touch on all of them. Like they can get the voters to be mad about all of this. So it's fairness and cheating. So like, are we taking money from those who work hard and giving it to the ones who aren't working hard? The loyal and betrayal foundation. So are we loyal to the institutions, to the traditions? So conservatives are very much about that. And the lefts are like, fuck that. Right. The authority and submission stuff. So again, conservatives are really into that. the left says, let me turn that on its head, and the sanctity versus degradation. So feeling, disgusted. And some people, like the left, could be a lot. Like I wrote an article about, the OnlyFans. She's trying to break the world record on having sex with the most men in one day.
Yeah.
And I'm like, disgust is a good thing. We cannot erase that from society. Even if like you don't want to believe in this Judeo-Christian God, I do think we need disgust, because he proposes we don't have disgust, then we can't have sacred. And we have to have sacred, even if it gets displaced and gets very like fundamental. So I thought that was really neat. I wanted to touch on that. We do have intuitions that drive our moral foundations. And so when you were online, you said that we're like, that's mostly the left. And so they're so triggered by this care and this oppression, and their own beliefs have been radicalized against them, that like their empathy has been radicalized against them. And I think we've seen that during the pandemic. I'm like, I understand you care about people. I do. But how they're trying to get us to care about people is not actually going to work. Like making a healthy person wear a mask. That's not, like, I am not the reason why people are dying in the hospital. Okay. So it's really difficult, because you want to, like, I see their hearts. That's why they call them bleeding heart liberals. Am I right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel you, dude. Like, I feel you. I really do. Like, I can, and I do. So I really appreciate all that. So if you guys are interested in any of that, the other thing I wanted to touch on, have you heard of the book, The Coddling of American Minds?
It sounds familiar, but I have not read it, but it sounds like I've heard it before.
So yeah, you just touched on some of the concepts. They talk about the 3 great untruths that have come about on the school's campus. And so the 3 untruths, number 1, are the untruth of fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And so that's basically what we've seen happen. And the second untruth is that emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings. And the third untruth is the us versus them. Life is a battle between good people and evil people. And that's what I said when I left evangelicalism. And then I saw these others leaving evangelicalism, but now they're stuck in still the us versus them of the left. I was like, bro, sis, don't you see you're literally just switched hats? Like, I'm sad, because I was like, I thought we were deconstructing out of shit. Like, not that that's easy, but I just wanted to touch on there. Yes, that coddling, that fragility. Like, I noticed that I can have that. And that's like the culture of the zeitgeist is kind of calling for that. So my piano teacher, she does not allow for like long nails. She's like, the sound on the keys tells me it's time to cut your nails. And she doesn't allow for me to chew gum. And I love that. I'm like, yeah, whip me into shape, lady. Like the discipline. I like kind of crave that in today's society. I know my husband looked at me. She's like, I was like, oh no, that's so normal in music. Like, you can't have long fingernails playing the violin either. So I really appreciate you touching on that and giving some good tips. You want to add to anything before I move on to the fake intellectualism concepts?
No, I agree with everything, right? And yeah, it sounds familiar, and I feel like I've come across that.
I bet you have.
It sounds so familiar, but what's interesting, and we just to quickly touch on the truth, right? One of the biggest things that I've realized is the truth is going to be the fundamental truth, whether I come up with it and I've never heard about it, or someone else comes up with it. It's like, oh my gosh, we're saying the exact same thing. So I just thought that's okay. I've read about this, I've seen this, and oh wow, I came up with that by myself, right? And you're saying the exact same thing, and that's what happens on a lot of the articles that we write about, because people are like, oh my gosh, I was just thinking about that too. So that's the only comment I just want to add on that.
Great minds think alike.
Exactly.
The 100th monkey theory, like where consciousness is elevating and we are all picking up what you're putting down, and that just excites the heck out of me. So that's really good news, actually. And so this article kind of plays into the rise of the fake intellectualism that comes after kind of what happened to critical thinking in COVID. And I really saw that a lot when I deconstructed out of Christianity. So many of these folks love science. They are obsessed with rationalism. And, even in this book, The Righteous Mind, they talk about how rationalism and belief in that is just like having faith in a deity. It's like, it's not real. And you have to be very careful of that. And that was kind of upsetting for me, because if you've done any psychedelic or plant medicine, there's something that I do want to be like anchored in something. Like you need reality, I think, so bad when you're ready to come out of it. I'm like, is this 100. My desk? Is this my desk? Is this my face? Like, I don't know what that desire. I think we do need something to anchor ourselves in. If it's sometimes when I get too into physics and esotericness, I'm like, no. I need, so anyways, I do struggle a lot with the craving of authority. I think we all do. I think it is, in diet culture, as a personal trainer, as a lifestyle coach, people want to be told, what do I do? What do I eat? It's everywhere. So that is where we saw a lot in the pandemic. We already kind of mentioned that there was like this ultimate authority. trust the science, don't do your own research. And that was like the opposite of anything I've ever said and done, because I'm all about self-efficacy as a coach. And I was like, what the kale just happened? And also the left, they were against pharma and big profits. They were about free speech. I don't know what happened, but it was like everything got flipped on its head. And so can you talk a little bit about that phenomenon? I know we touched on censorship a little bit, why most of social media is left. So that's where I wanted to kind of open the floor to that. Like what role, because you've mentioned it, like Meta, I threw in Meta because not just YouTube, play into perpetuating this issue, but it's mostly just about shutting down authentic dialogue. It's not okay. I had a whole old friend of mine from Portland lecture me about how we should trust in the authorities and that the system of whiteness and like this whole thing. And I was like, whoa, it was really intense, the lecture. So I knew I had to get on board with it, or if I didn't recite her orthodoxy, I'd be in trouble. So what's up?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, right. Fake intellectualism, right? And so, yes, everything you said is right. And man, psychology is amazing, right? When you talked about the amygdala, you have to understand, like, this is how we operate. And guess what? People know this. In my article, I talked about with the rat studies. They studied rats so they can realize what happens to humans. And there is an authoritative need in humanity. And guess what? They have milked that. They have taken that and milked that. That's why they give us politicians. That's why they give us celebrities. They give us idols, because guess what? Society needs these stories to push themselves. But guess what? If I can give you this to push yourself, I can also use this to move you where I want to move you, right? And so, of course, going back to what you're saying, we're grounded in reality. If there's one takeaway I want people to take from all this is you can't be polarized to being the left or the right. You have to develop what you and I talked about, which is that spectrum-based reality. You've got to see things on a spectrum. So you have to know, okay, you know what? I'm going to be blue today, but you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to be red, because this is how it goes. But even as I say that, you see how people realize it to say, well, guess what? I'm going to be a guy today. You know what? I'm going to be a female today. So that's the dichotomy of reality that we live in, right? But just going back to these fake intellectuals, humanity needs some kind of authority figure, and we need some kind of reality. That's where science comes in. But on the flip side, that can be weaponized against us, which is why it goes back to your very first question or second question, which is a very insightful question. How do we navigate through all this? We have within each one of us this divine BS meter. This is the divine BS meter that tells you something's not right. And they're going to indoctrinate you time and time again to stop listening to that. But if we can, in my article, How to Train Your Mind Part 2, which is a paid article, but I talk about that. That small voice is right 9 out of 10 times. The smallest voice, the most quietest voice is right. And so, like, you had that voice when the biggest propaganda campaign was, listen, wear your mask, stay indoors, do all this stuff. Well, wait a second. If I do that, well, I'm not going to breathe. I can't exercise. I can't do this. Like, it makes no sense. It's not supposed to make sense. And the problem is, and we can probably pick this up in one of my articles, the reasons for false flags is, listen, I have to lie to you. But if I lie to you, you're not going to believe it, right? So I have to tell you the truth with enough elements of a lie to where you know that doesn't make sense, but it sounds like the truth, and you're going to take that. When you do that, every single time you do that, you are turning off your internal intuition, and that's what they want. And so, how do we rise against this? We have to examine when these fake intellectuals stand up and preach their prophecies. We have to, especially when we have that voice telling us this is wrong, we must acknowledge that voice. If not, we lie to ourselves every single day.
Yeah, you're spot on. And that really does close down the conversation pretty well. Because in the last question, I touched on their article, The Power of Belief. And you mentioned there how often you like kind of pose the question, like, how often are we blindly accepting these narratives, whether it's in medicine, science, finance, or society at large? And that's just really, a good way to end it, being like, how often? Question that, be open to that. And then the most important aspect is check in with that internal compass the BS meter, as you called it.
Yep.
And what's so important is that social media fills us with so much noise, so much distraction that it also can drum that out or
Yes.
make it so hard to hear it. And so taking time, like social media can be one of the only ways you can connect. I get that for some folks, including myself, being isolated, but noticing that it might not be serving us as much. It might be filling our brains with noise so we can't hear that. So make sure you're just creating time. That's why people meditate. Maybe you can't sit still, but you need to journal or chisel out some quiet time, maybe in the sauna. Just don't bring in your phone or music and just sit there awkwardly like humans used to do, to just be with yourself, because silence is actually where you're going to get some nuggets of wisdom. And that's where we just have to create it. So thank you so much for your time. I know you got to go. I really appreciate it. We will do this again. I'm sure listeners, if you have any topics you want to request, let us know. Anything you want to say in closing down the conversation, because I'll let you go.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Appreciate the time. This was amazing. Yeah, sorry that I had to cut this short, but no, this was amazing. I think we just touched on the iceberg, just literally the tip of the iceberg. We could go on, and yes, let's set some time up. We'll do this again, and we'll really just have a great old time. But thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the space. Thanks for the support. And if there's anything I can do, please let me know. But looking forward to the next time.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, guys, for listening. And that's all I have for you today, folks. And when we say that we're just scratching the surface, boy, oh boy, is that true. So please check out the show notes, because we just got started on the article, The Power of Belief, and we had to cut off the conversation. I will invite Franklin back. Don't you worry about that. And until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.